California task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Content warning. Contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. Contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
9. Over creative, cultural, and intellectual life. Discrimination against black athletes. Following the end of slavery, most black athletes were forced to compete in segregated teams, sports, and organizations 272 prior to World War II. Some African Americans played sports at white universities, where they were picked for their talent. Ridiculed and mistreated by white students 273. Despite the inherent inequality of segregation, black colleges and their football programs thrived in the mid-20th century. 274. Many Americans believed historically black colleges and universities were of lower quality than white higher education institutions. Athletic achievement was a way to dispute this narrative. 275. HBCUs had fewer material resources but produced high numbers of professional athletes, particularly in football. 276. Integration of sports was a long and slow process because white Americans who held positions of power were hesitant to break the tradition of segregation. 277. Most major college athletics programs did not allow black players until 1947. 278. The Gentleman's Agreement was a standard rule that allowed coaches to bench black athletes during intercollegiate contests with all white colleges and universities. 279. In 1955, Georgia's governor asked the State Board of Regents to prohibit Georgia's all-white football teams from playing against teams with black players. 280. In the 1960s, the government and the sports industry punished black athletes who engaged in racial justice and political protests, or resisted racial oppression. 281. Muhammad Ali, the African-American Muslim boxing champion, of his world heavyweight title for refusing to be drafted into the U.S. Armed Forces. 282. When explaining why he would not join the Army, he pointed out the irony of being drafted to fight on behalf of a nation in which he was subjected to racial oppression. 283. Inches. My conscience won't let me go shoot my brother. Darker people. Not for big powerful America, he said. 284. Inches. They never called me nigger. They never lynched me. They didn't put no dogs on me. They didn't rob me of my nationality, rape and kill my mother and father. For what? 285. Ali was charged with a felony, fined, banned from boxing. 286. Later the Supreme Court would overturn his conviction. Justice John Harlan stated that the government had misinterpreted the doctrine of black Muslims by not recognizing Ali as a conscientious objector. 287. Ali experienced racial and religious discrimination by the government, which to recognize his religious beliefs and punished him for his resistance to racism. African American Olympic athletes have faced racial discrimination in athletics. 288. The Amateur Sports Act of 1978 gave the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, a private organization, exclusive jurisdiction over all matters related to the Olympics. 289. The federal government has provided funding for the Olympics when they are held in the United States. 290. In 1968, black Californian track athletes Tommy Smith and John Carlos protested the lack of African Americans on the United States Olympic Committee, as well as the stripping of Muhammad Ali's heavyweight belt at the Olympics. 291. They raised their black-gloved fists in a black power salute during the national anthem, standing on the victory podiums of the Olympic Games. 292. Subsequently, the International Olympic Committee kicked them out of the Olympic Village and banned protest during the Olympics. 293. When Smith and Carlos returned to America, there received death threats. 294. Today, many African American Olympic athletes are discriminated against, From being suspended for legal marijuana use to being forbidden from wearing swimming caps designed for natural black hair, 295 most Olympic athletes, many of whom are African Americans, in poverty and receive little compensation for their hard work, while high-ranking Olympic Committee executives and organizers are compensated generously, due to the billions of dollars in profit from sponsorships, donations, and broadcasting rights. 296. Similarly, Studi Shiveshantatha National Collegiate Athletic Association (NCAA) has profited from the labor of poor black students, whom live below the federal poverty line, and the United States Supreme Court has supported this through Case Law 297. The NCAA prohibits college athletes from being compensated for their labor. 298. Many public universities, which are government-funded, generate millions of dollars in revenue due to football and basketball teams that are part of the NCAA. 299 black students constitute nearly 60% of the rosters of football and basketball teams. Just 11% of the rosters of all other sports. 300 African American athletes who risk their health and safety to play these sports while in school do not receive any compensation. 301 Much of the money generated by football and basketball athletes is spent on salaries for coaches and administrators and on the construction of lavish facilities. 302 Americans began to play baseball in the late 1800s and historically joined professional teams with white players. 303 However, due to racism and legal segregation laws, they were forced to leave these teams by 1900. 304 In 1920, an organized league structure, called the National Negro League, by black businesspeople and athletes in Kansas City, Missouri. 305 The leagues were professional and became central to economic development in many black communities. 306 In 1945, policies of baseball changed when Branch Rickey signed Jackie Robinson of the Negro League's Kansas City Monarchs to a contract that would bring Robinson into the major leagues in 1947. 307 Football has a history of racial discrimination in the United States, sanctioned by state and federal governments. 308 Recently, NFL has engaged in racist practices against black athletes, many of whom suffered brain injuries while playing professional football. 309 The NFL used race norming, a racist medical practice where black players were assumed to have lower cognitive function than white players as part of a test to determine payouts in a brain injury settlement. 310 As of January 2022, there was only one black head coach in the NFL. 311 Like football, was originally a sport for elite white men. 312 Due to segregation laws, most tennis clubs explicitly or implicitly prohibited African Americans from participation. 313 Public courts were not fairly distributed in black neighborhoods or accessible to black players. 314 Today, prominent African American women tennis players, like Serena Williams, are more likely to be disciplined, fined, and criticized while playing. 315 In the 1950s, the National Basketball Association (NBA) had an unspoken rule that there could not be more than 2 black players on a team. Later that number was expanded to 316 more recently, in 2020. American women in the Women's National Basketball Association went on strike to protest anti-black police violence, building upon a long history of protests for racial justice. 317 Following the lead of black women, black male professional basketball players in the NBA protested. 9. Control over creative, cultural, and intellectual life. Black police violence in a historic strike, refusing to play games and talk to journalists. 318 Due to their efforts, sports arenas in areas with large African American communities were turned into voting locations for the 2020 general election to allow for safe Person voting, work that should have been done by federal and state governments. 319. See Chapter 4 on political disenfranchisement. There is consequently a history of racism in basketball, like in many other sports, which has harmed African American athletes. 320. Long been inequalities between men's and women's sports. However, for African American women, this is compounded by race. 321. One of the first women's track teams in the United States began at the all-black Tuskegee Institute in 1929. 322. 3 years later, two African American women, Stokes and Tiggy Pickett, qualified for the 1932 Olympics in track and field but were not allowed to participate due to their race. 323. Title X of the Education Amendments of 1972. Title X changed the landscape for women's sports. It requires any program or activity that receives federal financial assistance, including sports. Equal opportunities to all genders. 324. Title X resulted in a significant increase in women athletes. However, the percentage of women in coaching positions greatly declined. 325. Today, black women represent 88% of professional women's basketball. No black women in head coaching positions. 326. Despite Title IX's legal guarantee of equal opportunity, black parents have reported more sports programs for boys than girls in their communities. 327. 53% of white girls are most likely to be involved with sports at age 6 or younger. Only 29% of black girls are. 328. Due to the lack of Title X enforcement that centers African American women, the consequences of both racism and sexism in the sports industry, including underrepresentation in sports leadership and limited access to sports in general. The history of sports in the United States is one of racial discrimination, segregation, exploitation of black male and female athletes, a history in which governments have played a significant role. California. Many black football players experienced discrimination in California's colleges and universities. The University of Southern California did not permit black athletes to play until the 1920s. 329. While the University of California, Los Angeles did allow black players to play in starting positions on its football team, Los Angeles community was not as accepting of black athletes. 330. At San Jose College, black athletes reportedly faced discrimination in athletics, such as overbearing coaches, a lack of academic assistance, exploitative demands made on black participants, prejudice outside of the sport, and hostility in the campus Greek system and the local community. 331. Professor Harry Edwards, psychologist who helped organize black athletes against discrimination, was called unfit to teach by California Governor and later President Ronald Reagan. 332. Athletes have often protested discrimination in sports in California. Take for instance Colin Kaepernick, a black Californian who was the quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers. 333. In 2016, he knelt during the national anthem in protest of anti-black police violence. 334. Subsequently, the President of the United States should find a country that works better for him. 335. The National Football League then stated that it would find teams whose players did not stand for the national anthem. 336. Kaepernick was ultimately told he would be released from his contract by the general manager and coach of the 49ers. 337. Since then, NFL teams have refused to sign Kaepernick on as a player, despite his clear record of success in athleticism. 338. The University of California system has also reproduced racial inequities in its revenue-generating athletic programs. 339. It has some of the lowest graduation rates for black male student athletes, who comprise a large majority of the male student athlete population. In comparison to overall graduation rates. 340. As of 2018, the black male student athlete graduation rate for the University of California, Berkeley, was 39%. Lower than the 91% graduation rate for students overall. 341. The graduation rate for black male student athletes at the University of California, Los Angeles was 57%, while the overall graduation rate was 91%. 342 black male student athletes rarely accrue the benefits of higher education. Athletics. 343 black athletes report that coaches prioritize athletic accomplishment over academic engagement and discouraged participation in activities beyond their sport. 344 though many black athletes aspire to become professional players. And National Basketball Association draft fewer than 2% of student athletes each year. 345 the University of California system pressures black student athletes to labor for its highly profitable athletic programs while they receive no compensation, risk damage to their health. Their focus from their education, all for the unlikely chance at being drafted into professional sports.